Good afternoon, everybody. What a great crowd. Thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon. This is our fifth teach-in of 2017 here at Politics and Prose. I'm Lisa Muscatine. I'm one of the co-owners of the store with my husband, Brad Graham, who's over there. And we're delighted to have all of you here, and especially delighted because we think, and it looks like you all agree, that this is a subject that we're going to be discussing today of enormous importance to the future of our country. How many of you have been to a P&P teach-in up before now? Okay, so a bunch of you have. So those of you who have been, and we'll know a little bit about the history, but I'll just tell the rest of you quickly. We've had 4 before now, one on civil liberties, one on women's rights, one on immigration, one on climate change. And we decided to launch this series very closely after the election. And we did so really in response to being in what we felt was unprecedented terrain. A situation since the election in which many of our democratic institutions and values felt as if they were under assault or certainly subject to misconstruing. And obviously, as I think we all feel very acutely, in an atmosphere of deep division and anger and incivility in our country. So we wanted the bookstore to continue its place in our community as a sanctuary for honest discussion, for the respectful exchange of ideas and opinions, and to really be a safe and inclusive gathering place. So we started thinking, what could we do? And we, I hope you all know, have a wonderful fair of books and author events here in the store. We have an incredible array of classes and programs and trips and other activities that we offer. So we tried to think of other things that we could do in this very unusual situation that we find ourselves in. And how could we give readers an opportunity to find ways that they themselves could also become more engaged and more involved and more learned, frankly, about issues of concern to them. And so what we decided to do was to do these teach-ins sort of modeled after what those of us who are old enough to admit it remember from the 1960s and the civil rights and Vietnam War movements, where people would gather together just to try to learn and exchange ideas, and hopefully in a place of respect and civility. So we decided to have these teach-ins, and what we do with the teach-ins is to have a discussion with people who know a lot about the issue. We then invite questions and comment from the audience. We prefer if those comments don't become long-winded exposés that go on for hours, just so that as many people as possible have a chance to say what they would like to say. And then we also provide reading lists on the topic. We have an incredible display up front for this particular teach-in. We've gotten recommendations from our panelists and others. Just to name a few of the titles that you'll find up there, you'll see, and I'm going to mention David Osborne's brand new book, which isn't really even out yet, but we got it, so it's up there. Reinventing America's Schools. We've got Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? This is a really important book, and Beverly Tatum will be here at the store to do an author event for us. So I just want to call your attention to that. We have These Schools Belong to You and Me, Deborah Meyer and Emily Gasoy, who are affiliated with Jane's organization. And then, of course, we have many works by Jonathan Kozol, who some of you may know we had hoped would be able to be here today, but he wasn't able to be in the end. So please take a look at our display table and the list of offerings we have in relation to the teach-in today. You'll find other titles relevant to current events on some of our other display tables. You might even find some things related to current events in our science fiction and horror sections. Sorry, just couldn't help myself. But let me just say, we've been very, very delighted by the overwhelming enthusiasm for these teach-ins. We're planning several more, so keep your eyes out for that before the end of the year. This teach-in, as all of our teach-ins, is being live streamed on Facebook, on our Facebook page. And if anybody is tweeting, could you please use hashtag teach-in for this teach-in. So why a teach-in on education and why now? I think we all are sort of, in a step ahead of an avalanche every day with headlines in the news, dominated by healthcare reform, immigration, Paris climate agreement, taxes, a border wall, possible government shutdown, North Korean missiles, and, of course, investigations into Trump and Russia. So in the midst of all of that, it's easy to forget that perhaps the most important single issue to the future of this country may be the state of our nation's public schools, the best indicator, perhaps, of our capacity to prepare the next generation for the rigors and challenges of a very unpredictable and dangerous century, at least so far. So simply put, amid this political den, we felt we could not afford to take our focus off what has been a bedrock of our country's progress for several centuries. So to help us guide this discussion and to learn more about the state of public education today, and to help us assess the future of public education in America, we are really, really lucky and honored to have an extraordinary panel of experts who are also extraordinary in their generous giving of time, wisdom, and insights with us today. And I'll do a quick introduction of them, and then we'll get this show on the road. Dawn Williams has been a teacher at every level of education. She's taught elementary school, high school, college, and in graduate programs. She's been a member of the Howard University faculty since 2003 in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies, where she just recently served as the department chair. She believes that considerations of social justice are integral to teaching, research, service, and professional development, and she's made this integrated approach a hallmark of her education experience and practice for more than 20 years. Next to Dawn is Jane Ehrenfeld, who, by the way, was once an employee of Politics and Prose. She's the executive director of Center for Inspired Teaching, an educator and attorney with a decade of teaching experience in public schools in Prince George's County and in Boston. She met Jonathan Kozol here, she told me just before this event, at an event where he was signing books and speaking, and she waited in line for 2 hours to talk to him, and they have been friends and collaborators ever since. In fact, her classroom was the focus of his 2007 book, Letters to a Young Teacher, and she's also worked with him on a variety of advocacy projects related to public education and published education-related essays in a number of publications. Wearing her lawyer hat, she served as deputy director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Public Policy and was an attorney in the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education. David Osborne is the author or co-author of 5 books concerning government effectiveness and efficiency, including the New York Times bestseller Reinventing Government, and has authored numerous articles for the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, the New Republic, Education Week, and others. He's currently at the Progressive Policy Institute, directing a project on reinventing America's schools, and he's, as I mentioned, he's just published a book with that same title. It is up front, in case, I think, are you holding a copy? You could, plug it right here now. There you go. Good. So now you know what it looks like. You can look for it more efficiently. He's also, by the way, a novelist. He has written a well-received piece of historical fiction called The Coming. Moderating our panel today is a dear friend and former colleague, a journalism colleague of mine and of Brad's, Valerie Strauss. She covers education for the Washington Post and runs the blog The Answer Sheet. In her 40-year career, she's reported for the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, United Press International, and Reuters, focusing early on in her career on foreign policy and national security. But over time, Valerie recognized that covering education, while perhaps less glamorous than foreign affairs and national security, was nonetheless no less captivating and no less important as an American issue. Since taking over the education beat at the Post, she's made it her business to challenge the education policy of Republican and Democratic administrations, as well as local district superintendents and college presidents. She's also made it her business, indeed her trademark, to give voice to those on society's margins, especially kids who are ill-served by institutions, people, and policies that are supposed to do well by them, but instead fail them. Valerie's not afraid to speak truth to power, and it's safe to say that as one of America's leading education journalists, she has anchored policies on every side of the political spectrum. Her blog, which I hope some of you read, called The Answer Sheet, she began reluctantly at the request of higher-ups at the Washington Post about 8 years ago, but now it is consistently one of the most widely read on the Washington Post website, a testament to her integrity, fearlessness, and passion as a journalist, and her ability to make a wide range of issues accessible to readers interested in education. So with that very long-winded beginning, I'll now turn it over to Valerie and to our great panel, and please welcome all of them with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. I couldn't have written that better myself. I'd also like to express my gratitude and that of the communities to you and to Brad for taking on the job of first maintaining and then deepening the role that this store has in educating the community. I think it's fair to say it's never been more important than it is now, so we certainly greatly appreciate all the things that you do. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming to participate in this teach-in. We're doing this at a time when the public education system in America, which is arguably the country's most important civic institution, is under enormous stress, and its very existence is being questioned by policymakers. We are well into the modern era of school reform, which we could say started with the 2002 implementation of George Bush's No Child Left Behind. The idea was to try to close the achievement gap and end inequities in the public education system, which we all know exist. But that's not what happened. The Bush and then the Obama administration implemented school reforms that, in fact, some would argue, did the opposite, made new problems, created new issues to be solved, and there are some egregious consequences that schools have been facing. They include, and this is not anywhere near an exhaustive list because I could go on for days with it. We all know about this obsession with standardized testing, in which everybody had to take a test, and it got so bad that they decided to use the test scores to evaluate teachers. Now, the problem was that they only tested math and reading. They didn't test history and art and science. So in some places, they decided to test teachers on subjects they didn't teach and students they didn't have. That actually happened. They also, in the Obama administration, decided that every student should be able to take a test to be evaluated, so the teachers could be evaluated. That meant every student, no matter how severe their disability, and I do remember having one conversation with a special education federal official saying, why would you insist that this boy in Orlando, Florida, take a test when he was only born with a brain stem and has no cognitive part of his brain? And the answer was, well, because everybody can learn. And I wound up screaming into the phone, he doesn't have a brain. And my colleagues around me just thought it was nuts. Screaming into the phone, he doesn't have a brain. So after gaining steam in recent years under the Obama and Trump administration, actually not after, also school choice has become a very big issue, perhaps the biggest now with President Trump and Betsy DeVos, who are ardent supporters. In fact, Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, has said that traditional public education is a quote-unquote dead end, and they are determined with money and with the bully pulpit to expand alternatives to traditional education. Those include charter schools, which are publicly funded but privately operated, and vouchers and voucher-like programs that use public money for private and religious school education. This is not a partisan thing. There are Republicans and Democrats on both sides of each issue. It is a very controversial subject, and I'm sure we're going to get to all of these. So let's get started. We're going to first have a little discussion up here, and we will soon bring you into it. So come up with good questions, and if you have them, we have over there. Please, if you have a question, when it's time, please go over there and make it into the microphone. Let's start with Dawn. The first question that I thought that we could get started with was, describe what you think the biggest issue facing public education today is.
Thank you, Valerie, for that overview. Also, thank you, Politics and Prose, for the invitation. And thank you all for showing how much you care about education with this beautiful Saturday coming in to spend time listening to us have this discussion. In that overview that Valerie provided, there was one thing that I thought was particularly telling where we're moving within the educational system, and that is around traditional public schools. It seems like we're not only losing resources, but we're losing the discussion around traditional public schools. When we're talking about reform and what that might look like in schooling or in education, that reform conversation generally is not based upon the traditional public schools. Now, why is that problematic? That's problematic because the majority of students, of children, attend public schools within the U.S. Public schools or education, as we know, is the great equalizer. It continues to be. It is an institution that is a democratic institution, and it's an institution that serves children no matter what their background, no matter what their disability. It opens its doors to everyone. Now, are there issues within traditional public schools? Absolutely. But the diverting of resources and even attention at the federal level and even so much at the state and local levels is troublesome, because the attention is being paid to institutions that have not been fully tested, that don't have the same level of accountability. These institutions where resources and attention is being diverted to are not performing at the same rate as public schools. So if we are going to start the conversation around public education, traditional public education, I think we need to make sure that we are doing or giving our just due to giving the type of narrative about what should we be doing in traditional public schools, and talk about if there are other alternatives that exist, what those alternatives look like. But we cannot lose sight that public schools are the hallmark of our democracy. I just want to get a little show and tell for a moment. How many of you are products of public schools? That's very, very telling. Now, while we all may have advice about how schools can improve, I think that public schools have done quite a good job of producing very fine citizens of this country, and we need to understand more about how we can produce finer citizens of this country by looking at what public schools do.
Thank you. I'll just say, when John is talking about the majority of students who go to traditional public schools, that is the vast majority. It's about 85%. 10% of students go to private and religious schools. About 4 to 5% are homeschooled, depending on whose numbers you believe. And then there are 6% that go to charters, which sometimes are called public schools because they're publicly funded, and sometimes, in court cases, the judges have ruled that they're not because they don't operate like public schools. So that is a controversy all in itself. Jane.
So first I want to echo Don's thanks to Politics and Prose, which is such a wonderful, happy, safe place for having us here, and to all of you for coming out this afternoon. I want to take us in a slightly, maybe, different direction than the conversation might have been going. I agree there are huge and intractable problems that are facing public education. And even broader than the system itself, there's entrenched poverty, there's racism, there's playing politics at the expense of what's good for children, there's resource scarcity. These are huge problems. But I am first and foremost a teacher, and from my experience in the classroom, from all of the work that Inspired Teaching has done in the course of 2 decades, I think that the biggest challenge is somewhat different than what we've been thinking about. Because the challenge I'm thinking about, if we solve this one, we will solve all of our other problems as well. What I'm talking about is that we have an education system that still, in 2017, is built around fostering student compliance. And I think compliance is the trait that most threatens our society, our country, and our world. So what is this compliance-based system? It's a system that doesn't value student voice. It's a system that doesn't teach students how to think. It churns out rote thinkers. It churns out adults who lack the critical thinking skills and the agency or the creativity they need to thrive in and contribute to this incredibly complex, challenging world that we live in. And maybe that doesn't sound as scary as entrenched poverty, but what I know is, and I'm sorry to say this, and I exempt the high school students in the room from this, you and I are not going to solve entrenched poverty. I hope we don't stop trying, but it is going to be up to the students in school today to solve the biggest problems that we're facing in this world. Our students are also inheriting an incredibly complicated and very quickly changing world. So it's estimated that 65% of students in elementary school now will be in jobs as adults that currently don't exist. And so a compliance-based system that doesn't teach creative thinking, that doesn't teach kids to be nimble and flexible, is not preparing students for the world that they're going to inherit. So we're going to hand these kids climate change, an exploding world population, unbelievable income inequality that's growing every day, the aftermath of a Trump administration, and we think that kids taught compliance are going to turn that around. That is the definition of insanity. And speaking of Trump, this is the moment where I think more than any moment that probably any of us in our lifetimes have encountered, maybe with some exceptions, that we have to think about this most seriously. So about a year ago, before the election, Vox published an article called The Rise of American Authoritarianism. And authoritarianism was designed as the psychological profile of individual voters that is characterized by a desire for order and a fear of outsiders. It's what leads to Trump. It's what leads to xenophobia, bigotry, calls for incredibly harsh laws, banishment of outsiders, punishment of moral deviance. And what researchers studying authoritarianism discovered was you can't just walk up to somebody and ask them if they're a racist, because they tend to say no if they're smart. And so you need a proxy. You need something else that you can ask about that will tell you whether or not somebody has authoritarian tendencies. And the thing that they asked, the thing that they found was that perfect proxy was parenting style, parenting goals. So they could ask 4 simple questions to get at authoritarian personalities. And those questions were, is it more important for a child to have independence or respect for elders? Is it more important for them to have obedience or self-reliance? Is it more important for them to be considerate or well-behaved? And is it more important for them to have curiosity and good manners? That's it. They asked about compliance, and the people who comprised compliance in children were the ones with authoritarian tendencies. So think about that in a world of Charlottesville and the world of the travel ban and hate crimes and all of the other abominations we're living with, and then tell me it's not critically important that we banish compliance from our classrooms.
Thank you. You're saying that transcends the private school, the public school, the charter school debate, that it's all private, that everybody's doing the same thing.
And I would say every sector is getting it wrong.
Right.
So,
okay, thank you. David.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you, all of you folks, for being here, and Politics and Prose for doing this, and you two for joining us. It's great to be here. I'm going to come at this issue that you raised from more of a systemic point of view. And I would say there are lots of problems we could talk about in public education. I'm going to focus on urban public education because I think that's where the most severe problems are, and we do happen to be in a city today. And I would say that the biggest problem that underlies so many of the others, including this compliance focus, is that in our school districts, we're using an organizational model that's over 100 years old. It's called bureaucracy. We're using a model that developed when the industrial era was born, was put in place by reformers, was considered cutting-edge organizational corporate model at the time. Centralized hierarchical bureaucracies that use rules to control their moving pieces and deliver standardized services, which means in education, the same kind of education for every child. You know, the ideology 50 years ago, even when I was in grade school, was the only fair thing to do is to treat every kid the same, even though we now know that's profoundly unfair to about 80% of them. So, unfortunately, you know, that model did its job during the industrial era. But the world has changed in really fundamental ways. You know, we have all these wonderful technologies now. We're in the information age. We have a global marketplace. We have lots of international competitors. And when I was in high school, the ticket to the middle class was a high school degree. It's now essentially, not always, but essentially a college degree. That's a big change. And for the first time, a couple of years ago, the majority of public school students in this country are low income, and the majority of public school students are minorities. So the students have changed. Everything has changed. And the problem is, it's not that our school districts got worse, it's that they really struggle to adapt to these changes. They take a model that's just kind of given, and these kids arrive. I'll just give you one example, motivation. The traditional public school at least the ones I went to, assumed the kids were motivated. If you arrived motivated, they'd fill you with knowledge. But in our inner city schools, what percent of the kids arrive motivated? Schools have to take motivation as job number one. Another example, kids come from different backgrounds with different learning styles. They thrive in different environments. And so they're going to succeed in different kinds of schools, which means we need a variety of different kinds of learning models, different kinds of schools. And fortunately, a lot of our districts are struggling trying to do that. Washington, D.C., the D.C. public schools is a good example. They're creating a lot of variety. But it's taken enormous struggle, and in most districts it's very slow because we have a system with lots of rules and constraints. And when we have innovative, wonderful people running schools and teaching in schools, as we do, they're so constrained by the system they're in, and it's so hard to make a fundamental change. So, to me, the thing we most need to do is move beyond this centralized, hierarchical, bureaucratic model to a different way of organizing the public school system.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask you all to think about something that you would ask each other about what you just said, but I'm just going to comment that I've been covering education for a very long time, and I don't really know the answers. The more I know, the less I know, as it is. But one thing I think that, from listening to some of this, that jumps into my head is that administrations, Republican, Democrat, state, local, federal, approach reform in a very narrow way. It's always about the school. We heard that entrenched poverty is not going to be fixed soon. No, it's not. But it can't be ignored because how kids grow up, what they bring into the school matters. It matters to their student achievement. We can say it's not going to be fixed, but it has to be addressed. So school reform to me is not just what happens inside the school. It is health policy. It is housing policy, because it is institutionalized housing policy in the United States that has created segregated neighborhoods and segregated schools. And the schools are more segregated today than they have been since 1954, when Brown versus Ford came down from the Supreme Court. So I don't think that we are going to fundamentally improve solve most of these problems until we actually look at all of the elements. And we have to do it if we want to really improve schools in a multifaceted way. As for what David said about the institutional model, I don't see schools in quite the same way that he does. We have 15,000 school districts in this country. Some of them have 2 schools in them. Some of them have hundreds of schools. They're very different. They have tried to adapt with the times as policymakers have allowed them to. I will also say that a number of the charter schools and the private schools that have been thrown out as alternatives use almost the same kinds of things that have been tried in public schools too. I don't actually think there's any innovation that you've seen in a charter school, although they will say they are, that hasn't actually been tried first in a public school. Maybe they do it in a different way. So for me, it's a very highly complicated issue. So I did feel a little bad asking them to name just one thing that was bad. I did feel that. Do any of you have any, before we get to what you would do about the problem that you mentioned, do any of you have any questions you want to point to?
Well, and so Valerie, you said that you don't have all the answers, but you write the blog called The Answer Sheet.
I'm so sorry. I apologize for that topic.
which I am a fan.
Such a bad title.
So I'm fresh off of a conference yesterday that we hosted called the Urban Superintendent Academy Conference. It's where superintendents or aspiring superintendents meet monthly over the course of 9 months, and yesterday was their kickoff. So much of the conversation we were having was about systemic reform and what superintendents at the district level do, and particularly in the urban environments. So I probably have to push back a little bit on the type of flexibility. So what I was hearing from these superintendents, which I was elated to hear, is that they are involving their communities in what they think needs to happen. They are involving the voice of the community. Just as you all are here today learning more, they go out into the community to do that, and we encourage them to do so. I hope that it brings about some type of change within their particular respective districts. But another point that David made that I think was very true was how we look a lot alike what we looked like 50 years ago, 60 years ago even, the way the schools are structured, and within some flexibility in districts, I think they try to make some type of advances. But the urban school districts in particular, where diversity as it relates to urban school districts, nationally, our public schools are comprised of about 51% of students of color, students who are in minority groups. However, the teaching force does not reflect the student base. So there are 18% of the teachers in the U.S. are teachers of color. That does not reflect the 51% of students that they are serving. Within the 18%, 7% are African American, 2% are African American males. So although education is very complex, it is an ecosystem, there are bits of things that we can do along the way to try to advance the needle. And one of those things have got to be diversifying our workforce. That goes a long way with what the morale of our students would feel, and even the motivation that you spoke of, I think what really serve us well. I am a product of the New York City Public Schools, and from kindergarten through 12th grade, I did not have one African American teacher. So people ask me, why did you go into teaching? I went to a historically black college, University, North Carolina A&T, and there is when, because I started off as political science, I wanted to be a lawyer like you. But then it was at that time where I started to see professors who looked like me and encouraged me and motivated me. That made a huge difference in the trajectory of my career. So I did want to address some of that, of what you said, David. Thank you for those comments.
Valerie, I'll just say that I did try to limit my focus to urban districts. I understand there are small school districts that don't have a lot of bureaucracy. I'm talking about the urban districts.
Right. So let's start again with Dawn about what you would do to remedy the issue that you first identified.
Okay, so the issue that I first identified was us diverting focus away from the traditional public schools. When I asked you all how many of you are products of public schooling, the majority of this audience raised their hands. So you are an advocate. No matter what your profession, no matter if you have children in the schools or not, you are an advocate. So the way that the U.S. works, as we all know, education is not listed in the Constitution. Therefore, you have a representative that you can express these concerns about. So I live in a community in Prince George's County that is a middle-class community, and I have a 3-year-old who has not yet entered the public school system yet. So I'm at that stage, though, of where I'm asking questions about parents. Where do your children go? What do you think of your school? The majority of the parents in my community go to private schools. And it's okay. That's their choice. But it leaves me with the question of, why aren't they going to the regular public school? And they may, well, and I question them on that too, but their answers to their questions is that they don't think that the public school is performing at their expectation. But when I look at this from a systemic approach, those parents are not investing into the public system. If the majority of those parents put their kids in that public school, that would be an immediate turnaround. Immediate. As a former classroom teacher, I remember and I recall every parent that would come to all the parent-teacher conferences, that will call regularly, that would write regularly. And guess what? As a teacher, good or bad, I paid attention to that kid because I knew that the parent was going to be asking me questions about their child. So I wanted to make sure that I had answers for that parent. Those parents are my neighbors. That's exactly who they are. Those parents are my neighbors who are sending their children to private schools. If the majority of them went to the regular public school system and they demanded certain types of curriculum, even concentrating on less compliance and more critical thinking, they will get that. But because they are not as a mass force going that route, is leaving this void within the public schools. So I'm not an anti-private. I am for parents making their own choices about schools. However, I know how powerful parents as advocates can be. So, in short, my advice is really for the general public, for you all, to invest in your public schools. Ask the critical questions of your educational leaders. Ask the critical questions of those teachers. Monitor the progress of your children. Make sure that you are an involved parent. Make sure that your policymakers, your representatives, know what it is that you want from the schools.
So I could not possibly agree more, and I want to build on that a little bit. So the teacher, we know from lots and lots of research, is the single most critical factor in a student's education and their success. And so at Inspire Teaching, we focus on working with teachers to help them transform the school experience for children. And what's really important, I think, where every person in the community, parent or not, can really engage, is the idea that we need to be fostering schools and classrooms where students learn that their voice is important, where students are actively engaged in their learning. And when I say active, I mean intellectually, emotionally, and physically engaged in their learning. Our body, as Ken Robinson says, our bodies are not the vehicle that carries our brains around, right? We go to school, we should be getting an education that fills us and engages us completely. And so we can all advocate for that for all of our children. We can advocate for students learning change making. And we do that by helping empower teachers as change makers. When teachers feel empowered, when teachers feel like they have a voice, then children feel like they have a voice when they're in their classrooms. We need to also, and this, I think, I take your point very seriously, Dawn, think a lot about equity and diversity. Right? We need to stop talking about our children and their children. Mm-hmm. That happens way too much in education. I hear it all the time. These kids need. Those kids should get. No. I have two of my three kids are here. They're both in public school. I want every child in America to have the exact same education that they get. I'm not distinguishing. And so we need to stop having that conversation as well. Low-income kids need. Children of color need. All kids need engagement. All kids need their voices to be lifted. All kids need to emerge from school feeling like change makers, feeling powerful in the world. And I think, again, to your point, Dawn, teachers have an unbelievable responsibility, and we as their community have a responsibility to take a hard look at our own biases and what we're bringing into classrooms, into schools, what we are creating in society, to make sure that we're sending the right message to kids, to make sure that when we engage with them in courageous conversations and when we ask them to go out to the world to engage in courageous conversations, that we've done that our own internal work first. So that's maybe step one. Do the internal work first and then engage in every level possible and never ever distinguish between your own kids and anybody else's kids.
Thank you. I would say, since you brought up teachers, that it's worth noting that the teaching profession is incredibly demoralized as a result of policies over the last 15 years. In the Bush years, it was providing a scripted curriculum where teachers had to just read what was said. Then it was about bad evaluations. It's about attacks on their unions. The evidence of this is clear. Colleges of education are having very low enrollment numbers. The education majors used to be one of the biggest majors in regular universities, and it is no longer. States have enormous teaching shortages, not just of teachers, but of substitute teachers. So this in itself is a big problem, which is trying to regenerate an interest in people who want to become teachers. David.
Thank you. So, as I said before, I think what we need to do is evolve post-bureaucratic models of organizing our public school systems. I've spent the last 5 years looking at the fastest improving cities in the country in public education. And it's no coincidence that they're the same cities that are doing the most profound change in the way they organize public education. So by far the fastest improving city in the country is New Orleans. Some of you probably know the story. Before Katrina, it was one of the worst. It was corrupt. It was incompetent. It was almost financially bankrupt. And the Democratic governor and both parties in the state legislature were so fed up with it that after Katrina, they took all but 17 schools away from the local school district and put them in something they'd created 2 years before to turn around failing schools called the Recovery School District. And that district, which reported to a state board, gradually turned those schools over to charter operators. Today, you have 5 schools left in New Orleans that are not charters, and they will all convert in the next year, probably, unless something very unusual happens. This is by any measure, by test scores, by college-going rates, by graduation rates, New Orleans is just off the map. This is a very poor city where 80-some% of the kids are low income, 82% are African American, and they are exceeding the state average in high school graduation rate and college going rate. Just think about that. There's no other city in America where you can say that. Second city is right here, Washington, D.C. As you know, you have a thriving charter sector here, and by 2007, they'd taken about a third of the kids away from D.C. public schools. And the city council finally, under that competitive pressure, agreed with the mayor that they should do away with the local school board and hand the schools to the mayor. The mayor hired Michelle Rhee, process of reform. Kaya Henderson followed Michelle Rhee, and my hat's off to the district. They have done more profound reform over the last decade than probably any other big city district in the country. And they're improving the test scores, graduation rate, everything is improving. But they do well with the white kids and the middle class kids. And if you look at the data, when we're talking about the poor African American kids, the charters still beat the pants off them. So that's the second example. The third is Denver, where you have an elected school board that 10 years ago decided that they should embrace charters and make them part of district strategy. And you now have 21% of the kids in charters there. You have 21% in what they call innovation schools, which are district schools treated more like charters. Denver, when they began this, was the worst of 20 large districts in Colorado. By 2012, it was the fastest improving and has been ever since. And it is, according to one study, one of the fastest improving in the country. So what we need to do, essentially, and there are other cities, Indianapolis, Memphis, Camden, New Jersey, that are moving in this direction. What we need to do is learn from these examples. What is it that makes the difference? I think it's 4 or 5 things. It's giving the school autonomy so that the principal and the teachers, hopefully the teachers are involved in running the school, helping to run the school, so that they can make the decisions rather than all the decisions being made at central headquarters. Secondly, that they have accountability, that if the kids are not learning, the school is replaced by a better operator. And if the kids are really hitting it out of the park, the school is encouraged to grow and replicate. Third, choice for parents between different school models and the freedom to create different school models. And fourth, the people who run the system, who authorize the schools, don't operate the schools. Because when you have a unified district where thousands of employees essentially work for the superintendent and the school board, those people are captive of their employees politically. They can't change things too fast. They can't get the adults upset, because if they do, there will be repercussions at election time, and either school board members will be voted out or superintendents will lose their jobs. So those are the keys, and they don't have to be charter schools. You could, some places call them Renaissance schools, some places call them innovation schools, but it's a different way of organizing the public education system.
Thank you. I'll just raise this point. David and I have had this conversation. But you haven't heard us. So I will just throw out just a couple of the thoughts that we have had. The subject of charter schools could be its own teach-in, and you can sit here for 24 hours and talk about taking a bathroom break, and you still wouldn't solve it. There is, they're very controversial. How you measure their success is very controversial. Whether they even educate the same cohort of students, which means you'd be comparing apples and oranges in terms of student body, is up for question. One of my big issues that I've written about over the years is how we actually assess students and assess schools and assess teachers, and we do it in a very narrow band with standardized test scores. So when we talk about a charter school doing better than the district, first of all, a lot of them don't. Charter schools aren't monolithic. And so some of them do well and some of them don't. There is a big argument that in New Orleans that a lot of those schools don't do it quite as well as it would seem when someone says that it's the fastest growing, the most quickly improving school district. But that is for another teach-in when we'll just do charter school. Okay. I would also just say that if I had to do one thing, if I had the power to change one thing right now in public education, it would be to change all the funding models. Because the funding is inequitable. Okay? You don't want equality for students. You want what's equitable. Some students need more than others. In this country, it's only in this country that school funding is primarily based on property taxes. So poor neighborhoods have less. The federal funding that's supposed to compensate doesn't. And so you have teachers all over the country right now going to shop and spend $600 on average so they can have supplies in their schools. This is insanity. And this is the very basic stuff that still isn't being addressed. So, do any of you have anything you want to say about whatever any of us said? And then we can open it up. So think of some questions and line up when we're done, Jane.
So just to build on that too, I think the private funding piece is really important. So I think New Orleans is a great example. Between 2005 and 2015, New Orleans got $250 million in private funding to support its just for the public school, for the schools. So
DC got it.
Right, DC got a huge amount of money as well, in the hundreds of millions. So how do you replicate that, scale that? That's not sustainable. So any system that's propped up entirely by private philanthropy is not a system that is going to work long term.
Can I reply? Because I know a lot about New Orleans, and they had to rebuild 100 ruined schools. That philanthropy went partly to that process. They also had to bring back a teaching force. They had a lot of challenges. And pardon me? Closer. And in D.C., I think the majority of that philanthropy went to the district, not to the charters. So I don't see how you can say that the successes have been because of philanthropy. The scale is just, it's not there.
Nationally, though, private funding has doubled over the course of 10 years or so towards schooling. Again, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in private philanthropy, and it plays out in smaller ways, too, to Valerie's point about funding models, right? You can go to a school as a public school, public charter school student, and if the parents at that school have the fundraising ability, they can raise $100,000 in a single night, $200,000 in a single night. Suddenly you've got an art teacher and the school down the block does not. So, I mean, there's all of these funding, and you're right, that applies to the traditional public schools and the public charter schools. It's the same throughout. But I would say there's been a huge amount of private money that has been propping up the charter system in particular. But I want to talk about one other point as well, which is to build on what do we mean when we say succeeding. The test score piece, of course, we all kind of can talk about that all night, about the value of a test score, to talking about success. But I would also say you can take a group of kids and beat them into submission, right? You can train them to get good test scores, and the methods that you use to do that are horrifying. And so I'm not sure I would say that, even high school graduation, sure, that's great. We're getting kids with diplomas, but at what expense? There have been, when you read about what's happening in no excuses schools, it would make any compassionate person weep
Does everybody know what a no excuse school is?
No.
So no excuses school. So these are schools that use unbelievably harsh discipline for kids to get them to be compliant so that they can sit still. And we're talking about so there's a school in New Orleans, I'm sorry, I keep going back there, but where high school students had to walk along an orange tape in the hallway. And if they stepped off the orange tape, they got demerits. They got in trouble. If they leaned against a wall, if they closed their eyes. There are schools where you have to sit with your hands folded at your desk. You may not unfold your hands. There are schools where it is better to wet your pants than to stop taking a test for a minute. These are, it would make any compassionate person weep. And these are practices that we say are kind of okay as long as the test scores are high enough. And the flip side of that coin is look at college attrition rates. I think you're starting to get a lot of these no excuses schools where their kids now have come through enough generations that they are coming out of college, they're going to college, they're getting through college, and they're learning the hard way that if you spend 12 years or 12 plus years telling kids what to think and forcing them to be that compliant, when they get to college, surprise, surprise, they can't succeed because that's not what they've ever learned. They have no agency. They have no voice. And so a lot of these schools, and the more self-reflective systems are really grappling with this, are realizing, wait a second, we have made a terrible mistake here. But not all the systems are self-reflective, and so you have things that I would count as child abuse happening all over the place in service of high test scores, in service of success. So I'm just saying, I want to change the definition of what a good school is and what success is, because we are getting away from it.
I just want to agree with most of that. And you're absolutely right. The key is changing how we measure success. This obsession with test scores was, No Child's Left Behind was the dumbest law for so many reasons. But the obsession with test scores, where states and districts put 80 or 90% of the weight in their accountability systems on test scores, was just a huge mistake. Don't get me wrong, I think tests have a role. I think we need to know if kids can read. We need to know if they can reason. We need to know if they can do math. But should we put 80 or 90% of the weight in measuring a school's quality on that? Absolutely not. We need other factors. And right here in D.C., if you went to the public charter school board, you would see a very sophisticated way of measuring school quality, which includes visits to each school every year and trying to gauge the school climate, trying to gauge the pedagogy, the teaching quality, and we need to include that. We need to take a qualitative look at each school as well as a quantitative, and then we need to ask the parents. We need to survey the parents. And frankly, if we can figure out a way to do it without the teachers biasing the kids' answers, we need to survey the kids because they know what quality is and what it isn't. So I agree with you, and there's a whole chapter in here about changing the way we measure school quality because it's critical.
I see the long line of people who want to ask questions, so I will defer to allow for some community voice.
Let's do that. Let's start.
Hi, I just want to make a practical point. I'm a DC resident. I send my daughter to public school. I'm a teacher, and my wife is a nurse. And my daughter's at school from 7 to 5 most days. Her school operates from 9 to 3. I was limited in the choices I could make because the local public school does not offer before and after care. So I think that before and after care is often left out of the conversation about education, but I think it is an important part and we should include it in the conversation.
Thank you. Next question. Who's next? Come on up. Come on up. Move it.
So I used to teach 9th and 12th grade, and one of the biggest problems that I saw was the kids who came from different middle schools had just a diversity of abilities in my 9th grade classes. But then even in my 12th grade classes, the kids who had moved as a cohort through that school, there was still this incredible diversity of ability levels. Now, aside from like the necessary imperative as a teacher to diversify instruction for different ability levels and interest levels, the cohort model struck me as very restrictive in terms of how I had to structure my class and how the kids moved along with each other. So, David, you might be the person best suited to answer this, but do you know of any research on or have seen successfully implemented a school or a school district that tries to break away from the sort of like present, assess, move on kind of model where kids maybe move past certain checkpoints independently or at their own pace, so that kids who maybe fall behind don't just suddenly move up with them?
Before David answers, can I just throw something in there? And Dawn would probably might know a lot about research too. I would just throw in that notion. You're talking about academic skills. School is right. You're talking about the abilities of school of the kids you see academically, right?
Primarily, yes.
Okay. School is also, and it's not insignificant. And it's a laboratory for kids to be socialized.
Of course.
So the idea of trying to throw a 10-year-old with a 15-year-old because they both can do calculus has its problems.
No, of course, I'm not suggesting.
Okay, that's all. That's
no.
Okay, David.
So the answer is yes. It's happening around the country. And my favorite example, I think the best example is an organization called Summit Public Schools, which is in California and has opened a couple of schools in Washington State as well. It's a charter group, charter network. And they realized about 6 or 7 years ago that only 55% of their graduates were getting through college in 6 years. Now, for low-income kids, that's about 6 times the national average, but it wasn't good enough for them. So they went back and working with all their teachers, they redesigned the way they run that school, and they do personalized learning. So the kids, all of the content knowledge acquisition, the kids do with educational software. And they get to a point of competency, and then they can move on. And they have a teacher who's a mentor who's checking in with them weekly and making sure what progress they're making. But the teachers focus on the deeper learning, project-based learning, seminars, etc. That's where the teachers put most of their energy because that's the highest value added for the teachers. They mix the kids by age in high school, and they also understand that it's not just academic growth, it's personal growth that's important, and that kids have experiences in high school that are life-changing. And so 8 weeks of the year, in 2-week blocks, the kids do what they call expeditions, which are a deep dive into a subject or internship or a trip somewhere, and the teachers, the classroom teachers, while this is going on, are doing professional development, working on getting better. And it's professional development they choose, not that somebody chooses for them. So the fascinating thing about this is they're giving away their software, and they every year work with dozens of schools, traditional and charter public schools, from all around the country to help them institute what's happening at Summit Public Schools. And so this is now spreading through like several hundred schools around the country.
Yes, thank you. I hear you, and I understand your struggle. You didn't say what topic or what subject you teach.
Well, so I teach social studies, and I was going to say to David's point, I found that those kinds of adaptive technologies that teach the kids and work better for non-inquisitive, subjects that have different sort of pedagogies and methodologies like mathematics, and were less suited to social studies.
Okay, so
Sorry.
The difficulty that you're saying is how do I teach all these varying abilities within one class? And I think that the content or the topic is very important of how we do that. So we didn't use the word ability grouping or tracking because we don't want that. We have seen where research has shown that is not the most effective way for us to go. So in your situation, you mentioned diversified or differentiated instruction. That is the way to go. So whether it might be more professional development opportunities or you looking at videos of where it's been successfully, where teachers have approached that and have some success, that is what research has shown the way to go is differentiated instruction. And you have to be creative as a teacher. And so teaching is one of the most complex professions. So it is a skill that you have to adopt as a teacher. Now, I know that you probably have tried some things here and there, but there's more work that you may need to do or look into, or look at some examples of success of how, if I have a 10th grade class, but I have students read on the 7th grade level and those who are reading on the 11th grade level, how do I teach them and engage them? You want to do that, but you don't want to ability group them, because that has negative impact on several psychological traits, as well as not the academic progress that you would want to see in the long run. But I understand your struggle, because I've been there. But it is, you will have to kind of do the work, and maybe even express to your principal that this is an area that's of concern to you, and see if you can follow up and look at some examples of success.
Thank you. Next question. Just
So I will be succinct. And the question is, are you aware of the following? So I'm a retired professor of mathematics at the University of Maryland. And what we've seen over the last 15 years is that many more students are showing up not knowing Algebra 1. And I should say that from 1998 to 2005, the number of students going on to college increased considerably. The number knowing Algebra 1 actually decreased. Since 2005, it's mostly been flat. Separately, I'm in Prince George's County, and the data for reading in the English 10 test came out on Tuesday, and 1 in 3 10th grade girls in Prince George's County are reading on grade level. For boys, it's 1 in 5.
Is there a question?
Are you aware of this, and how is this relevant to what you've been talking about?
Any of the teachers want?
And of course, the other thing with Prince George's County is tremendous corruption.
Well, let's not deal with that right now. Thank you. John, do you want to answer this?
Well, and just briefly, as a retired professor, I applaud you for still remaining engaged in the educational system. Related to mathematics, I think that is a very important topic. It is a gateway subject. If students in high school, or really not high school, but middle school, if they aren't exposed to algebra at least by the 9th grade, then that causes a great deal of difficulty of them being able to apply to certain majors within college. So for those who are in the public school system, you really have to push for students to take algebra early on, so that they can be set up for the right amount or the right types of mathematics courses to be ready to go to college and major in certain disciplines. If they wanted to major in engineering, as an example, they would not likely get accepted into engineering if they had not had the right sequence of mathematics courses.
When students take science and math is a big question, and there's been talk about changing the order, and when you're pushing down curriculum to where students are not able to do it. And so that's another whole subject that we could get into. Thank you.
Hi. My question is for David. I'm just curious where you got your information about New Orleans. I just moved here from New Orleans. I am a teacher in TCPS. I work in Ward 7 at a Northeast school. I worked in Title I schools in New Orleans. And I'm going to tell you right now, the achievement might be there, but the pressure for the students and mostly no excuses schools exist. There's segregation, there's inequality, there's a lack of diversity in the schools. You might have a choice on where you go, but I'm sorry, I worked in those schools. I didn't see a lot of innovation. So I guess I'm curious, who is giving you this information, and is it accurate?
Well, I've spent a lot of time there over the last 5 years. I've been in a lot of schools there, and I've looked at all the data. And, there's an academic team at Tulane that has done a ton of research. There's all kinds of urban legends about what's going on in New Orleans, all kinds of misinformation, and a lot of people tell lies about it. But this academic team sort of looked at every possible explanation for what's going on. And
Are you referring to the
segregate-
Cowan Institute?
No, I'm not. I'm referring to Doug Harris's group, the Education Research Alliance at Tulane. It's segregation. The schools are less. I agree. They've been segregated in New Orleans since they were integrated and all the whites left in the 70s. Okay? But they're less segregated today than they were at the time of Katrina. That's a fact. And the source is a study by the Education Research Alliance. In terms of diversity of models, I would say that right after Katrina, as they began the transformation, the transition, there were a lot of very structured schools. The one you described, which I think is one of the collegiate schools, right? You have to understand that before Katrina, most public schools in New Orleans were chaos. There was a valedictorian at one high school who failed a test you had to pass to graduate from high school 5 times. Valedictorian. And the test was at a 7th grade level. These were schools in which kids were not learning and teachers were not teaching. So what first sort of took hold were these highly structured schools. Let's get control of the classroom. Let's get control of the hallways. It's evolved a lot since then. And the school that you described, collegiate, has changed tremendously since what you described. Their model of discipline is now restorative justice, which means not let's expel you or let's suspend you, but let's sit down with you and whoever you fought with or attacked or whatever happened, and let's talk about it and let's figure out how you can make up to our community for your behavior. Very progressive approach to discipline. So, the schools are evolving there, and there's more and more diversity of school model every year.
Can I just jump in for a second, too? I think what you're saying is the exact reason we need to hear from teachers more. And so, I felt this every single year I taught. I still feel it. That divide between what we talk about when we talk about structure and policy and governance and research and what we talk about when we talk about children and teachers in classroom has got to go. So I appreciate you standing up here and saying, I was a teacher, I am a teacher, this is my experience. I wish we heard that all the time because I think it's so missing from the conversation, and I'm so excited to hear your voice.
Thank you. All right, so
I agree with that. Can I just add one?
Yeah, real quick.
One of my daughters was a teacher in New Orleans for 3 years in a charter school, a lousy charter school. And I understand they're not all good. The difference between what's going on today and what used to go on is that the worst ones get closed and replaced by the best ones. And every year, the pool gets stronger.
Thank you. So we're going to try to get through everybody. So I'd like everybody to think about your question and figure a way to say it in half the time, as well as the answers. And I will just make this point in half my time. In my time as being a reporter, you can find research and a number to boost any argument you want to make. You have to be really careful about it. Graduation rates, you can fudge those really easily, and I can tell you how later if you want to know. Thank you.
So as white liberals with resources, we love to say, less testing, less testing. We love diversity. And yet we're spending more resources, people with resources, more resources on test prep, tutors, enrichment than ever before. And when it comes to looking at where we buy our houses, we're not looking for the school with the most diversity. We're looking for the school with the best test scores. And I hear it again and again. And I think we need to have a very honest conversation about that.
Sure. Is there a question? Absolutely. Is there a question in there, too?
Well, and then the second thing is that I'm not on the school board in Montgomery County. And when you talk about teachers of color, there's a wealth disparity between our white and Asian teachers and our teachers of color, as there is a wealth disparity across this country. They want to make a decent wage. And I was just talking to a 2% male teachers of color. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's an amazing male teacher of color. He has so much college debt that he's thinking about getting out of teaching. It's such a loss.
Yes, a lot of teachers take second jobs and even third jobs.
Right?
Yes.
So we want to pay our teachers more. We raised taxes last year so we can decrease class sizes and pay our teachers what they're worth. What happens? Property tax increase, people don't like it. So they love to say we love good schools, but then they don't want a property tax increase when you talk about property tax increases. And now they pass term limits because people were so upset about them raising taxes.
It's complicated.
It is.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question.
Yes. So I'm someone who has been on both sides of the public and private institutions and schools. And what I'm actually curious about, because we've had a lot of talk about the adults, parents, whether it's fundraising, other ways of funding. And what I'm wondering is, what is the best position for the parents to be part of their child's education? And where should they fit in this?
That's a big subject. Who wants to tackle that?
I'm happy to comment on it at least.
Okay.
I mean, parental engagement is critical. The data, the research is really clear. Kids whose parents are engaged in their education do better. And there are ways. The problem is most schools engage parents in a very Mickey Mouse way, if you will. You know, come to back to school night, and we'll do a dog and pony show, and then we won't see you. Maybe come to the PTA meetings, and you can help raise a little money. But there are models that have been developed. There's an organization here in D.C. called the Flamboyant Foundation that works with dozens of schools and basically teaches them how to really engage with parents, how to do home visits. And frankly, the charter sector really started this nationwide, doing home visits in the summer to get to know the parents. And then how to do a monthly or every couple months night where the parents come in and don't do a dog and pony show, but really engage them and help them learn how to help their students, because there are methods that work. And it's that kind of initiative that I think we need a whole lot more of.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
You asked a really important question, and as Valerie said, it's a huge topic. I'm going to be an obnoxious lawyer and answer the question I want to answer, which is one of my biggest concerns about choice is the parent question, because the entire structure of school choice presumes that somebody is making a choice for every child, and that choice is informed, and that those parents have been given the best information possible, and that information is impartial, and that it's complete, and that doesn't happen.
It's like in the lemon car thing, the second car.
Yeah. So that is my biggest concern about a system where a kid can't go to a school that's just a wonderful school, that's their school, and they get enrolled, right? My kids get to go, we live in Montgomery County, so glad to see a school board member here. The school, I know my kid's going to go to a diverse, excellent school because I just sign them up and they go there. And so I worry very, very deeply about all the children who don't have anybody making those choices for them, but it exists in a system where if you don't choose, your kid is in real trouble. And so I don't want to see a system that depends on choice for that.
That's at the heart of that's one of the hearts of the choice debate is what happens to the kids who don't have the adults who can advocate for them and knows how to apply to get into charter schools and get on the lists. And then you have some of these alternatives draining resources from the traditional districts. So then what is left for the traditional districts? The hardest to educate kids, the kids with the most severe problems. And you just see that actually in some of these districts. I think overall, traditional districts still educate a bigger percentage of students with severe disabilities. I know that in New Orleans they had a sue to get kids into some of those charter schools with disabilities. Were you wanting to say something? No? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just respond?
We've got.
So the alternative traditionally to public school choice is you go to your neighborhood school. And our neighborhood schools are residentially segregated. So is that the method you like?
Absolutely not.
So what's
Well, that's why I said housing
what's
policy.
the third method?
I want to see a good housing policy, as Valerie
Right,
said.
exactly. Thank you. Next question. We're going to have to really speak through.
So I taught fourth grade in Fairfax County for several years, and I'm this year going to be the Head Start teacher at my school. And I wanted to know if you have any advice, since this is now my family's first experience in school, and knowing that I can't necessarily fix any flaws in the system, just some advice on how I can make the school a welcoming place and a safe place for these people who have never experienced what I'm used to, having them come in fourth grade many, many years. What can I do for them?
Please learn your community that you're serving. So there are ways to do that. Invite parents. And one thing about parental engagement that I kind of have this alternative look at when we talk about data related to parental engagement is usually the statistics of who shows up to back to school night. That is not the full definition of parental engagement. When I take my son to the zoo, that's parental engagement. So there are a variety of ways that parents can be engaged. Make sure that you share that with them. So if there's something that's going on in the curriculum, present all things outside of school that they can do with the child. They can watch this program. They can go to this event. There's something happening in the community here. They can read this type of book. But please, please just get to know the community that you're serving. And when you take that interest into them, that goes a very long way with establishing trust with you.
Thank you. Next.
Hi. So I recently graduated high school under the Common Core standards. And I've often found, I originally come from a fairly rural school district, that we kind of have to do certain things because that's the only way we can get money. So one of those is, of course, following the Common Core standards. I've often found that kind of restrictive in a way that it doesn't necessarily encourage students to go beyond what they're required to do. And also, it has left certain students kind of up to dry because it forces them to jump into standards that they haven't been applied to earlier. So how can we address kind of mostly encouraging students to go beyond what is required of them, and also how can we encourage students to not necessarily meet the bare minimum?
Thank you. I would just say that's kind of a teacher. That's a teacher thing. The Common Core standards. Some people hate them. Some people love them. They're standards. Some of them were well drawn, and some of them weren't. And so it seems that it depends on how a teacher addresses them. Teacher training, better teacher training, more teacher training. I think that probably is as good an answer as I can give you. Yeah. Thank you.
And also, I think if we have accountability systems that are only looking at the results of Common Core tests, then nobody's going to have an incentive to go beyond.
Well, that's true.
If we have accountability systems that actually visit each school and look at what's going on, and if they're doing extra, they're doing enrichment, they're engaging the kids, that registers and that matters and counts, then we'll get some different behavior.
The accountability systems matter. Thank you.
I love innovation, but it's hard for me to think that if we don't solve the school funding problem, it doesn't matter how innovative our schools are. I had a really great public education. Probably wasn't very innovative, but there are things I could take for granted. I could take for granted a library. I could take for granted art class. I could take for granted gym and recess. I could take for granted the fact that I would have air conditioning and heat. The problem was that I had to get bused to have that education. It wasn't an education that I could get in my neighborhood. So until we change the funding, I don't really think it matters the model of the school. It matters that kids have access to that education no matter where they live. And that will only change if we change the way schools are funded. My question is, I'm not a parent, I'm not a teacher, I'm just a really passionate adult who cares about education. Yay! How do I engage this? I always feel stuck in figuring out how to engage public education advocacy when I don't have that.
In the same way Dawn said before, you don't have to be a parent. Everybody should care about it. Everybody's paying taxes on it. Everybody should care about it. In the same way, engage. you can be involved in schools, even if you're not a parent. You can.
There are a lot of community organizations that will help you to do that. I think I saw earlier Marion Wright Edelman, who was here, head of the Children's Defense Fund. But there are a lot of community organizations if you want to help to make a difference. Now, your difference may not change the world, but it may change the difference for one child, and that is absolutely worth it.
Absolutely.
And
Thank you.
Valerie, can I also jump in? Local government is so important. People don't pay attention to their school board elections because whatever, it's just the school board. The power that local governance wields, and I would say on a broader level, and this is just my ideological bent coming out here, but if we're going to solve the problems that are facing our country right now, it's going to start at the local level, so get involved in your local politics.
Do you live in D.C.?
I do now, but I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, which has a long history of.
Okay. In D.C., there are dozens and dozens of organizations involved in improving the schools. And, you know, if we talk afterward, I'd be happy to name some of them. I'm sure the others here could talk about others. There's a lot of opportunities.
Thank you. Next question.
I'm a retired professor of mathematics and statistics from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. My question is then, what role should be played by the Common Core state standards in mathematics? What role should they play?
Let me just say before somebody answers that, we have to really move more quickly. So answers have to be shorter. Everybody has to just ask a question, and we can't take any more questions after the woman who's at the end of that line. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, does somebody want to just briefly ask? Go ahead.
I could just jump in and say it's what Valerie said before. It's the teacher. So the standards of mathematical practice are just big concepts that say this is how mathematicians think, this is how mathematics works, not on a granular level, but on a very large scale level. And then it's up to teachers who need to be trained really, really, really well to be able to implement that well in the classroom. And so I don't want to paint with a broad brush what the entire Common Core is, when I think what it is a set of guiding principles that can be implemented well or badly.
Right. Thank you. We're going to have to move on. Yes, sir.
Hi. So thanks to Politics and Prose for doing this 60s style teach-in. My question is, it might be a kind of a rhetorical question, but I'm wondering, since we talked about teachers so much, I'm wondering if there would be room on the stage if there's another one for an actual classroom teacher. Here's why that's
these two women have taught for years.
I'm not saying previously, I'm saying a current classroom teacher, someone who's doing it right now. And here's why that's important, because it's been alluded to earlier, because that children see what's in front of them, and the message being sent right now is that classroom teachers' voice has been taken away by experts. And this happens not just here, it happens all over the country. So I respect your service as teachers, but as if it happens again, it would be nice to have a current classroom teacher.
Well, I understand your point, but I think that their service really stands in very well. These women.
Oh yeah, no disrespect to the past, to the the excellent.
Thank you. I get what you're saying. Thank you. Next.
Hi. So I work in Montgomery County. I'm one of the few black teachers in Montgomery County. I'm one of the fewer black teachers in Montgomery County. And what these professors have said is absolutely true. They're coming into high school unprepared. My question to you guys is, before the system became so structured from the industrial age, as you said, it was much more integrated. The idea of knowledge was much more integrated. Now we have these silos of math, chemistry, science, history, English. The kids don't want to learn this stuff coming in because they don't know enough to want to learn it yet. So when are we going to go back to an integrated view of knowledge so that we can really make learning fun again?
Well, I also look forward to that time. I think that the emphasis that we talked about earlier with schools being more like industrial, the way that they're run, but the standards are really running the show right now. And until we move away from that, I think it is going to be more rigid in the way that we teach children. So I also I agree with you.
I agree with you also, and I think we need, as we said earlier, we need to define school quality differently, and therefore schools be accountable differently. And we need an innovation sector where people like you have the authority to change the way your school operates and to create that integrated learning experiences for your students.
I actually think there's more integration of subjects that's going on in schools than that suggests. That doesn't mean that you're wrong, but I do think that there are interdisciplinary programs in schools and there's collaboration. And so you're right. We have to go beyond the model, but I think there is some. Next. Thank you.
My question is to all of you, and that goes to why we're having this panel today, which is to think about the current climate with our president and our secretary of education. The question is, we're all here because we care about public education. Can you boil it down to a simple but truthful way you can engage with our policymakers, our politicians, our representatives to continue to advocate for the importance of a federal role in our public educational system while there is some threat to that movement? How would you guide us in engaging with our representatives to advocate for that?
I would just say it's what Jane said, which is to get involved in politics, get involved in local politics, get involved in state and federal. Vote, go for candidates who make education a priority. That's it.
I'm curious just about a message you might encourage us to make sure we're sharing as to why and how the federal role for public education is so important.
Well, that's become cloudy, the federal role, because of the Obama administration.
I think for the next few years, the federal government's just going to be in retreat on education, and what matters is state and local. Trump's agenda is not going to pass Congress, and Congress passed the ESSA, backed away from some things, and have made it very clear they don't want to be aggressive in the education arena anymore. So just key decisions are now going to be made in state capitals.
The ESSA is the law that came after No Child Left Behind, and the reason Congress finally decided to pass it 8 years late was because the Obama administration micromanaged so much that there was a rebellion even among Democrats. So this is one of the reasons the federal role became questioned, and then of course Trump, they don't believe in education.
Well, I would also think beyond funding. So my former office, the Office for Civil Rights, what they do is they protect civil rights in schools, right? Race-based discrimination, sex-based discrimination, discrimination based on disability, they protect against all of that. So don't just think about federal funding of education, think about the federal role in education as a whole. And really be a powerful voice for that.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you for talking about the students' voices and students' rights in school. And I'd like to follow up on that a little bit. Here in Washington, D.C., we barely have community input into our schools because we've had over 40 schools closed against the wishes of students and community. We've had outsiders, the Illinois Facilities Fund, et cetera. We've got testing now, 70% of evaluations based on testing.
Is there a question?
So we don't have students. We don't have student input. Don't even have community input, much less student input and student voices and students' rights. So can you tell me of some places where students do have more say in running the schools, not just in the classrooms, but in actually making decisions in their school system? I understand that only one school board, maybe two in the United States, has a voting member of the school board. But can you tell me some examples of where students actually do have a voice in the running of the schools? Thank you.
One person who wants to take this.
I know one example.
Okay.
I know several examples. There's a group of charter schools in Minnesota that are run by teacher collectives. In other words, the teachers run the school and they choose, okay, you two do the administrative role, but we don't really have a principal. The teachers run it. And some of them extend that to the students. And they have a student body, student council type organization that actually is involved in some of the decision making. And it's a very inspiring model.
Okay, there's another group of schools called Democracy Schools. There's a book about it. You can order it from Politics and Prose while you're here, called Democracy Schools, and the students are involved in absolutely every single decision made in the school.
Isn't that program over now? Wasn't that what the First Amendment
No. I think we'll talk about it later. Last question.
Hi. Okay. I'm a school psychologist here in DC Public Schools, and my question is kind of twofold. So we've talked a lot about test scores and math and reading and writing. But can you talk a little bit about the importance of how to make it a priority? And our chancellor started to talk about that. But how to make it a priority that our students are not only good at math, but are also just good, compassionate people. And then we also talked a little bit about, especially with regards to charter schools, how we can make sure that special education students, no matter their disability, whether mild or severe, are kind of included in all of these things that we've been talking about.
Really good subject. Dawn, you want to make one?
I'll make a comment about the first part of it. The psychology is absolutely important. There are some schools where there's a floating psychologist, but and then there are some schools that have a psychologist that's there full time. Is fortunate enough to do that. I would advocate for the psychology professional to collaborate with the leader, the principal or the assistant principal, about having particular workshops that can be embedded within the curriculum, or that services that are provided are not just the one-on-one, but there's more group services. But make sure that there's a more active role in your profession within the school building, and you're not just there. Students are just seen to go to you for particular problems. So try to approach it in a more proactive way by saying, this is what I think will serve our students well, whatever the topic might be.
Thank you. You know, there's social emotional learning that a lot of it is nonsense, but so they need to make those better. Okay, that would help. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for participating.